The more that Bill Thompson talks, the more it's apparent that this case was built around Bryan Kohberger, rather than that the investigation led to Bryan Kohberger. Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky, and today I want to talk about the Idaho 4 case. I want to talk about this interview that I watched a few days ago with Bill Thompson and Ashley Jennings. It was Anjanette Levy who did the interview, and she asked some really good questions. A lot of questions that a lot of us have been wondering about. So I really wanted to watch this interview to see if Bill Thompson got a lot of the same questions that he got in his last interview with Nate Eaton from East Idaho News. And I wanted to see if he gave the same responses, and we'll get into that. But before we get into this video, I want to let you all know that I have been diving into this David and Celeste Rivas case. And if you're not following this case, it's very, very interesting. And you guys, we're going to have to talk about it. So that's going to start this week as well. I'm going to give you a rundown on everything that's going on in that case, and I think that you're going to find it interesting as well. But today, let's talk about the Bill Thompson and Ashley Jennings interview. So Anjanette Levy asks Bill Thompson the same question that Nate Eaton asked Bill Thompson in his last interview. And it's a question that a lot of us have. And that is, why didn't the prosecution require that Bryan Kohberger allocute in order to take this plea deal? Why not have him explain himself? And Bill Thompson gives Anjanette Levy a different answer than he gave Nate Eaton. Now, in his last interview, he told Nate Eaton that the reason the prosecution did not have Bryan Kohberger allocute is because the prosecution would not be able to corroborate his story. Basically, that they wouldn't be able to confirm the details that he was giving them. So that obviously sounded kind of ridiculous. Now, in this interview, Bill Thompson changes his response. And he says that the reason that the prosecution, along with Judge Hippler, did not have Bryan Kohberger explain himself is because none of us would have understood it anyway. I mean, think about that. He's basically saying that they didn't have Bryan Kohberger explain himself because none of us would have understood his explanation anyway, which to me sounds silly. I mean, that's what these hearings and these court proceedings are for, is to get the information from the defendant so that we can determine whether he committed this crime or not. And Bill Thompson, in my opinion, is basically sitting there saying, we didn't really want his explanation because none of us would have understood it. Now, Bill Thompson doubles down and he says that before they even arrested Bryan Kohberger, that the feds told him that even if this suspect explained himself and came out and explained why he committed this crime and how, that we, Bill Thompson is saying we, as in himself, the prosecution, the investigators, and everyone following this case, would not have understood his explanation because this case was so bizarre. So this case was so bizarre that we would have never understood an explanation that was given to us by Bryan Kohberger. I mean, that sounds ridiculous. In my opinion, these interviews that Bill Thompson is doing are not a good look. They look more like excuses rather than answers. So it sounds odd. Like if Bryan Kohberger was in court and said, I want to give you some information about how I committed this crime, was Bill Thompson just going to say, no, we don't want it. We don't want to hear it because that information is going to be something that none of us understand. So we'll just go ahead and try to prosecute you without an explanation. How ridiculous does that sound? I mean, it almost seems as though Bill Thompson thinks that he's talking to a group of second graders, and he's not. He's talking to a group of very sharp people who have been following this case from the very beginning. So it just seems odd because it seems like he feels as though he can just say whatever he wants and we're just going to believe him. And we already know that's not the case. So I was impressed because Anjanette Levy did press Bill Thompson about the weapon. You could have asked Bryan Kohberger where the weapon was. And Bill Thompson, he says, we could have, and maybe he would have told us. Maybe he wouldn't have told us. But we don't know if he would have lied to us or not. Well, if he lied to you, then obviously the weapon wouldn't be there. So you would know if Bryan Kohberger was lying to you or not. If he was telling you the truth, you would find the weapon where he told you where it was at. Now, something else that Bill Thompson says is that he doesn't believe that the weapon would have changed anything in this trial anyway. So now we don't need an explanation from the defendant because we wouldn't understand it. And we don't need the weapon that was used in the crime because it wouldn't have changed anything anyway. In my opinion, the weapon that was used to commit these crimes is a very important piece of evidence. It seems weird that he would even say that. Something else that Bill Thompson talks about is that the defense approached the prosecution about a plea deal. And at that point, the prosecution talked to the families and got with Judge Hippler and decided what they were going to do. Now, he makes it sound like they were very confident to go to trial because he says that they offered Bryan Kohberger this plea deal with basically no negotiations. Take it or leave it. So he makes it sound like the prosecution was ready and willing to go to trial. But then just a few minutes later, he says that the reason they didn't go through all of the formalities, such as having Bryan Kohberger allocute or finding out where the murder weapon was, is because they didn't want to lose the deal. They were worried that they would lose this deal. So they wanted to get this plea hearing out as soon as possible and get it on paper. So were they confident that they could go to trial and prosecute Bryan Kohberger? Or were they desperate not to go to trial? Because Bill Thompson makes it sound as though they were really worried about losing this deal. So I thought that was kind of interesting because he kind of contradicted himself when he said that, we were ready to go to trial. He made it sound as though they were doing Bryan Kohberger a favor, when in my opinion, Bryan Kohberger did them a favor by pleading guilty and not having them prove their case. Because in my opinion, I think that Bryan Kohberger had a good chance at trial to be found not guilty. So from the way that Bill Thompson is talking in these interviews, and it seems as though he would have a friend or someone around him who's an attorney who might be like, hey, Bill, maybe stop doing these interviews. You're making things look even worse. It's almost like he's downplaying the most important aspects of this investigation. It sounds ridiculous for the prosecutor to say that the explanation wasn't a big deal and that the weapon used to commit the crimes wouldn't have changed anything with the trial anyway. It could have changed a lot. If Bryan Kohberger knew where this weapon was, then that would be confirmation that he had, firsthand knowledge of this crime, that he was involved. It would be confirmation. But if he can't tell you where this weapon is, then maybe you might want to start looking in a different direction. So it doesn't make sense. The whole thing that Bill Thompson was saying about Bryan Kohberger allocuting and about them asking him about the weapon, it almost sounds to me like the prosecution really didn't want Bryan Kohberger to explain himself. Maybe they didn't want that explanation coming out, but that would be strange, right? I mean, why wouldn't the prosecution want to gather all of the information that they can? So it's strange because, in my opinion, it does appear that the prosecution is hiding something. It appears that a lot of people involved in this case are hiding something. You know, it seems like Bill Thompson is just a really bad actor. And speaking of bad actors, let's talk about Ashley Jennings, because she was also part of this interview. And Anjanette Levy asked her about the case. And she basically said what he said, pointing to Bill Thompson. But one thing that I found very interesting was that Ashley Jennings wanted to reiterate that investigators did not have Bryan Kohberger's name until December 19th. She keeps reiterating this. And like I said, Ashley Jennings is a horrible actress, in my opinion. I thought that she was horrible in the courtroom, and I thought that she was, a poor actress in this interview. But Ashley Jennings continues to say that investigators did not have Bryan Kohberger's name until December 19th. And she stresses that date, December 19th, which we know that law enforcement had Bryan Kohberger's name on November the 29th. We know this. It's in the PCA. They've already told us about this. I don't know why they keep pushing the December 19th date. Why not just tell us that you had his name on November the 29th when you located his vehicle and identified him? It doesn't make sense. But I thought that was interesting that Ashley Jennings wanted to make sure that everybody knew that they didn't have his name until December 19th. So forget what the PCA says. That's old information. We're working with new information. Why you got to keep bringing up the past, right? I mean, it just sounds ridiculous that they keep pushing this December 19th date when we know that law enforcement got his name on November the 29th. Now, something that I did find interesting in this interview was that they didn't talk about the roommates. They didn't talk about Dylan or Bethany. Almost like it was, a stipulation of this interview that they didn't talk about these roommates. Because, in my opinion, they're trying to avoid this because it doesn't make sense. However you look at it, this situation with these roommates does not make sense. I've tried to make sense of what happened with Dylan and Bethany inside this house, but it just doesn't add up. So I thought that this was a really interesting interview. And like I said, I wanted to see if Bill Thompson gave the same responses. I wanted to see if he backed up what he was saying in his first interview. And he actually changed his answer when it came to Bryan Kohberger explaining in court, in order to accept this plea deal. It almost feels like Bill Thompson thinks that he's talking to, people that don't understand and can't put two and two together, because he keeps giving us these responses that make absolutely no sense, and expecting us to believe that. So, like I said, in my opinion, I think that the prosecution is hiding something. I think that there's a lot of people involved in this case that are hiding something much bigger. And I'm not saying that a quadruple homicide isn't big enough, because in my opinion, that's monumental. Anytime 4 young people lose their lives, that's a big deal. But there's something going on in this investigation, with this prosecution, with this defendant, that doesn't add up. So that's my take on this interview with Anjanette Levy. I thought it was a good interview. I appreciate her asking the tough questions. I did think that we would hear a little bit more about Dylan and Bethany, but just listening to these explanations, or I should rather say excuses, just, kind of makes me think that there's a lot more going on here. So let me know what you think in the comments. I really do appreciate you guys, and thank you for hanging out with me today. If you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I hope that y'all had an amazing day. We'll see you next time.